Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We're very excited to share with you this afternoon. This webinar is around patients and professionals working together to improve kidney care. I'm Martin Wilkie. I'm a renal physician in Sheffield, and along with the team who you'll be meeting and others, we've been working on looking at aspects of patient participation in 4 quality improvement programs across renal. And we'll be talking more about that as we go through. This webinar involves our patient partners and colleagues talking about what it feels like to be a patient participating in a quality improvement program within renal, and to understand the challenges and the successes, the enablers around that. So that's what I'm going to lead you into shortly. It's been really a journey coming to this point. We've worked our way through a series of questions. We've canvassed and involved a group of people and distilled the ones that we think are really important to try to answer. But of course, this is part of an ongoing dialogue, and we're very much looking forward to your involvement too. Can I have the next slide, please? We have on this webinar today 285 delegates or registrants, of whom 58 are patient partners. So that's excellent. 65 people who are registering are from Black and Asian minority ethnic groups as well. And we think that's very important too. I'll update you more data on who the registrants are as we go through. This slide just gives you some practical housekeeping points. We will be dealing with questions during the discussion session at the end. Please put your questions into the question and answer button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll collate those. You can vote on questions as you see them by using the thumbs up to move a question up and give it priority. Some questions will be answered during the webinar if they're practical and our team can respond to you. Otherwise, we'll pick them up during the discussion at the end. If there are any technical issues, please put those into the chat box and we'll try and resolve those promptly. Just to say, IT can be a pain. If your IT is not working properly, there are things you can do like logging in and logging out. We will go on to mute during, apart from those who are speaking. So great. So now it's my privilege to hand over to my co-chair, Claire Kaur. She's going to introduce herself and the rest of the wonderful panel that we have this afternoon. So thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Martin. Hi, my name is Claire Kaur, and I've been a renal patient since I was 8 years old. Following 2 years of conservative treatment and 2 years of hemodialysis, I had a kidney transplant, and I celebrated 40 years of that the other week, so it's still going strong. I now work as a doctor of research science in the Department of Transplantation at Leeds. And over the years, along with lab work, I have also done clinical trials, working on several projects to do with QI, both regionally and nationally. And as such, I'm a person who can see kind of both sides of the coin, so to speak, and as such have been asked to sit on several boards, such as UK Renal Trials Network and KQIP. As Martin said, I am one of the co-hosts, but I'd now like to introduce you to our panel. Start with Sonia.
Hello, my name is Sonia Lee. I was the programme manager for the Shared Hemodialysis Care Programme, working with Martin and Andy, who are on this call, for the last 4 years. I also managed and co-wrote the Renal Services Improving at Scale report, and so really pleased that this learning is being shared with so many of you here today. As the daughter of a renal patient who dialysed at home and had a kidney transplant back in the mid-80s, I grew up with the impact of renal failure, not just on my father, but on the rest of the family, especially in terms of what we ate at meal times, but also the mountains of medical paraphernalia that was stored in open shelves in what was my bedroom before I was kicked out and it became the dialysis room. The world is constantly moving, sometimes slowly and sometimes, like at the moment, very, very fast. And continuous change is inevitable. So for me, being involved, listening and helping to draw voices together to move in an agreed direction of travel of patients and professionals is what being a programme manager in health is actually all about, and why I'm honoured to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. I'd now like to introduce you to Andy.
Hi, my name is Andy Hamwood, and firstly I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity for being involved with this presentation and the build up to it. I'm a kidney patient, been a kidney patient now for about 13 years or so, had a short time on pre-dialysis, 4 years on hemodialysis, and then I've been transplanted ever since. Through, I suppose, after about a year of being on dialysis, I then got into being a patient representative for various quality of life aspects for patients which started on the shift, and then it evolved to a hospital, and then it evolved to doing aspects for the region within the local implementation groups. I then moved on to being a patient partner, so to speak, within the shared hemodialysis care program, the first one, which was Yorkshire and Humber. And that ran on for about 2 years. And after that, we had a little bit of a break where I went back into doing as much of the things that I could for the hospital that I'm with, and then was re-asked again by Martin to be involved with a shared or a scaling up program called Shared Hemodialysis Care, or Share HD. And that was very much about trying to encourage patients to be more active where they wanted to be in their own care, and to maybe let some of the healthcare professionals release some of that responsibility to those patients that wanted it. And on that second program, I was the patient lead. So, and I've really since then, and I think part of that really has opened our eyes really in relation to how can we help patients to become more involved. Hence, we've since come up with and co-founded the Kidney Patient Involvement Network, KQIP, which you can see on the screen behind me, from which I am co-chair. So once again, thank you, and I'm also privileged to be here today.
I'd now like to introduce Amjid, please.
Thank you, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Amjid Ali, and I'm a kidney transplant recipient. I was diagnosed with chronic renal failure at the age of 20 with no history of kidney disease. I spent 23.5 years on home hemodialysis before receiving a living kidney donation from my nephew in 2011. As a dialysis patient, I was fortunate enough to maintain a full-time role and spent 26 years at HSBC. I took early retirement in June 2012 based on medical advice. My work today and what's led me to being here today is on the back of the role that I have with NHS Blood and Transplant, which is partner and project lead of the Transplantation in Islam initiative. That brought me to the attention of Tracy Rose, who invited me to assist her on the Assist Tpckd project. Securing an updated religious edict on transplantation and organ donation in Islam in June 2019, and my contribution as an advisory panel member on various health forums that I sit on has also led to my appointment as a partner for BAME engagement and inclusion with Kidney Care UK. I hope that my contribution on the various health forums and the initiatives that I've been involved in has helped to increase awareness and understanding of the value of engaging patients from diverse backgrounds. And it's a wonderful feeling to be able to give something back to the NHS when they've given so much to me and my family. And it's an honor and privilege to be here today.
Thank you, Amjid. Now I'd like to pass you over to Tracy.
Hi, thank you very much, Claire. My name is Tracy Rose. I've been actively involved in kidney care for the last 25 years. When one of my eldest daughters, it was a late diagnosis and had end-stage renal failure. I've got 3 grown-up children now, and 2 of them have had 3 kidney transplants between them. So over the period of 25 years, I've been involved in peritoneal dialysis, home dialysis, and I've been a living kidney donor myself, which was 20 years ago. I've been really involved because I need to answer a lot of lots of questions. We still don't know a diagnosis for my family's kidney failure. And that led me to ask lots of questions, and I became involved with Kidney Research UK and was a trustee there for 6 years. And as a result of that, I also became involved in some of their quality improvement patient projects and research projects. At that stage, when I was first asked to become involved, I had no idea what quality improvement was. I had no idea what scaling up was. But I've been delighted to be involved in a few projects, and latterly the Assist Tpckd and patient lead on that. I think one of the points that people forget, doctors, medics, other patients, is that kidney patients aren't just kidney patients. They very often have, you know, important roles behind them and other sort of attributes and skills, which also add to the voice of patients and their roles and how they can be really important on really changing the scale or changing the pathways of kidney care and making it better for patients everywhere. And I think nobody should be scared to think that their voice doesn't matter, because everybody's opinion is vital and nobody can be better than a patient that's actually receiving care.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd now like to introduce Kirit.
Hello everyone, my name is Kirit Modi. I'm a kidney transplant recipient. My first transplant was a living donation from my wife, and my second one was from a deceased donor. I'm the president of the National Kidney Federation, and as most of you will know, NKF is the largest kidney patients charity run by patients for patients in the UK. Personally, I've gained a great deal by offering my support, because my health has been good because of the transplants, on a voluntary basis for many years. Just to give you a couple of examples, I believe in change, and through the NKF and the support of the All-Party Parliamentary Kidney Group, I led on the writing of 2 manifestos for change, one on living donation and one on BAME matters. And I think both have resulted in improvements for kidney patients. I obviously gained a great deal, personally, a great deal of satisfaction that my health has enabled me to give something back to support other kidney patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirit. I'd now like to introduce Della.
Thanks, Claire. Good afternoon. My name is Della. I'm the founder of Gift of Living Donation. This is an organisation that I set up after coming forward as a living kidney donor for my brother. We mainly raise awareness of organ donation within the Black community. I'm the author of More Than a Match, a book that I wrote about my journey and my family's journey as a potential living donor, and all the emotions and all the different things that kind of go into that. I'm also the producer of We Are a Family, which is an educational film that really kind of talks about kidney failure within the Black community. Last year, we organised the first ever event in the UK where we brought together over 200 Black living donors across the UK. So primarily our work is raising awareness of living donation within the Black community. Thank you.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Nick Selby.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Nick Helby. I'm a professor of nephrology at the University of Nottingham and a consultant at the Royal Derby Hospital. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I've got to admit it's a first for me presenting in a webinar, so looking forward to it. I think the reason I'm involved in the panel tonight was that I was the chief investigator for the Tackling AKI study. This was a quality improvement programme that was designed to improve standards of care for patients who sustained acute kidney injury. And that was a programme that was rolled out across 5 UK hospitals within the framework of a research study, so we could also evaluate the effect of that. So thank you, and looking forward to taking part.
Thank you, Nick. We'll now start with a presentation by Sonia, please, looking at the background to our report and the projects which we're going to talk about. Over to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Claire. Okay, so we have to thank the Health Foundation for providing funding for a unique opportunity to write a report that pulls together learning from 4 scaling up projects in the renal community that have run over the last 5 to 6 years. Scaling up is where a proven local initiative is taken and deployed to further sites in the belief that similar benefits should be able to be obtained, but also with the recognition that this may not always be quite so easy as at first thought. So to briefly explain the 4 programmes, the first is tackling AKI, or acute kidney injury, which Nick has just mentioned there. This programme was to improve hospital acute kidney injury recognition and care delivery. It's got 3 key components: an electronic detection and alert, then a care bundle of actions to follow when that alert is triggered, and thirdly, an education programme for staff. The specific approach was first deployed in Derby Royal Infirmary, and patient involvement was primarily via local patient groups in the hospital teams that deployed that intervention. Assist CKD, or Assist Chronic Kidney Disease, was at the opposite end of the kidney pathway. This was a computer program and training that was deployed in laboratories, and it tracked the graphs of kidney function using what's known as EGFR, which is estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is really a detection method of early detection of chronic kidney disease. And it allowed this to be spotted and for the GPs to be notified that an action would be needed. The main objective was to reduce late presentation of renal replacement therapy, for renal replacement therapy. And it had been developed at the Heart of England NHS Trust. At the start of this programme, it recruited a large patient involvement group and a specific patient lead, who's here, Tracy, who mentioned this earlier. And she worked together with that programme, and that group of patients worked together with the programme all the way through the delivery. The third programme was Shared Hemodialysis Care, which was a collaborative of trust teams working to routinely offer patients the opportunity to participate in component tasks relating to their hemodialysis treatment in a dialysis centre setting. Key elements of the intervention are a patient competency record, staff offering patient support and training to achieve their personalised goals. It was initially developed in Yorkshire and the Humber with a specific, another Health Foundation funded programme called Closing the Gap. And patient participation in this project was by a patient lead, Andy, who's here today, working as part of the programme team all the way through, but also each trust having a patient advocate who came to the learning events with their team. And during the learning event days, that group formed together into their own forum to take forward specific considerations and then play those back to the wider group. Finally was transforming participation in chronic kidney disease, or Tpckd, if you can actually say that quite quickly. It was funded by NHS England and run as part of the Renal Registry's Think Kidneys programme. It looked to support patients build the skills and knowledge and confidence to self-manage their health. It was slightly different to the other 3 programmes in that it didn't take a local specific initiative to scale up. Rather, it developed a toolkit and various other measures, such as the patient reported experience measure, that are now reported on nationally each year by the Renal Registry. Their programme really placed patients at the heart, striving for 50% representation in all work streams, and the programme board was co-chaired with a patient and clinician. So between these programmes, the whole pathway of renal services was covered, from early detection of trends in primary care to acute kidney injury in the emergency care setting. But what we found by writing the report was that there was a consistent set of themes across all these programmes, and we drew those together into 5 key chapters in the report that we published on the registry website. The 5 key chapters were definition of the change, implementation of the change, evaluation of the change, and management of the systems and processes surrounding the programme. The 5th theme, and the one that we're covering today, focused on involving patients together with frontline professionals. So I'll hand you back now to Claire and Martin, who will take through to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you very much. So Sonia's summarised the programmes of work that we're going to consider today. I just want to make a couple of points. I forgot to tell you that this webinar is being recorded. So it'll be available to listen to later as well. So that's really good. I also want to explain to you what quality improvement is briefly. We use the acronym QI. Quality improvement basically describes mechanisms to try to improve the quality of care. And we're focusing on how we do this within kidney services and why involving patients as partners really strengthens us in doing that. So now I'm going to start asking questions to members of the panel. You have already given us some questions, but we're going to use our pre-prepared questions, but we'll pick up anything else at the end, I hope. So the first session is around setting up and making it work. So setting up the project and making it work. And the first question goes to Tracy and then to Amjid afterwards. So the question is, Tracy, what are the benefits of involving patients in the setup and running of a program? If I could leave that with you, Tracy, thank you.
Thanks, Martin. I think, as Amjid said in his introduction, we were both involved at a very early stage of the Tpckd process, even before the funding, or even part of the funding application that went to the Health Foundation. I think that was really important because patients are the people that are going to be affected by this. So although medical professionals might have their opinions on what they'd like, really the patients are the key people that know what they want and what works for them and what often some small changes can make. So what we get out of a project is really what goes in at the front, at the beginning. So, you know, if we really need to tailor that to what the patients think is important to them. And I don't think I can really overstate that enough. So that was exactly what we tried to do with the Assist CKD. We thought, you know, both Amjid and I have had experience, and I know he will talk about that, of having late presentation to GPs, or GPs not sort of probably reacting as we'd like. So the key criteria for me was really to try and highlight to GPs how important it is to look at the EGFR. So if we could, through the system that was Assist CKD was trying to scale up, if we could improve the GPs or in primary care's knowledge of what to look for and make that a highlight, then it was going to help patients not really end up, as I know crash landing in secondary care is a horrible phrase, but really patients trying to improve how their care path works so they didn't get in at the far end. Because, you know, there's lots and lots of evidence which shows that if a patient is caught early with kidney disease, then their outcomes and their criteria and everything else about their process is better. You know, we can make sure that they feel better the whole way through. So, or even in lots of cases, maybe, you know, not get them through to that end stage kidney disease and that need for a transplant or dialysis. So anything that we could do in that aspect to guide the project to that criteria was what was important to me, and that's why we were involved at an early stage.
Thank you, Tracy. So now I'm going to pass the question on to Amjid. Amjid, what are the benefits of involving patients in the setup and running of a program?
I'd just like to echo what Tracy has said in terms of how I came on board. I was invited at a very early stage when the business case was being put together. And I feel I was able to help on a couple of fronts, actually, both as a patient with my lived experience of unfortunately being diagnosed very late. And that was more to do with the fact that, you know, generally my health was good all the way through. And I didn't really show symptoms until the very end, at which point where I insisted on having a blood test, which then identified that I had chronic renal failure. So that was some 3 decades ago. I hope that, you know, there's been some learnings around that, and GPs are in a position where they're more active about identifying potential problems with certain pain groups earlier on. But in terms of the double edge to my approach was the background I have in finance and strategy. So coming from a banking background, looking at the proposal document and actually seeing it for the cost benefit analysis of doing the work rather than just as a patient. So it was nice to be able to share that feedback with Tracy and the team. And what I'd like to say is that what was really key for me is that I felt engaged throughout the process. And I think that's important for any patient involvement, that we're recognized and valued for our contribution and any suggestions that we make. And if they're not used, then there should be a reasonable explanation as to why, because that's what would keep the individual on board. So I felt it was a great opportunity, and I'm glad to have been able to assist.
Thank you, Amjad. And you bring in a very important component there, is that as a patient, you're bringing your particular strengths and experiences to the project, and that's absolutely key. Okay, so our second question then is around patient representation. So the question is going to Nick and to Kirit after that. So how do we achieve patient representation at the program concept period? When the program is less defined, how can patients help at that stage? Nick, could you take that one first, please, if that's all right?
Sure, and I think this follows on very nicely from what Amjad and Tracy were just saying, that early involvement in any project is crucial. I think also that the landscape has changed over the last few years. So if you think back to the start of our project, so the start of the Tackling AKI project was in 2015, and the design phase was even before that. And I think if you compare that time to where we are now, I think the appetite and the acceptance that patient involvement is crucial and extremely valuable has really become much more widely accepted. And that's really important, because hearing the patient voice at the point when you are sort of planning and designing studies really gives that opportunity for those inputs to change and shape the project. So what does that mean practically? Well, I think from sort of my side, when you're sort of leading and designing, it means thinking about patient involvement early on. And then I think the second sort of practical thing is that many renal units now, many research groups have active patient groups that meet 2 or 3 times a year specifically for this process. So we can hear what patients think are important and put questions to the group. And I think when we're trying to do that, it's quite important that the questions aren't broad, but actually we think about the areas of the project where we really need patient input to change or shape things, or where we need a decision that the patient voice is going to be really important for that. And then that over time develops, it builds a relationship, and that sort of regular working becomes more efficient and easier. And just sort of simple things really, co-production of materials that are going to be patient facing. These are the sort of simple things that you can sort of start with alongside the inputting of ideas into a project.
Thank you, Nick. So now I'd like to pass that question on to Kirit about how we achieve patient representation during the concept period.
Yes, I think that's very important, that to involve patients at an early stage. And the main reasons for doing that is that patients can then influence it, they can shape the project. And also it's important for patients to have an equal say in the project and not an afterthought. And the question is really, how do we do that? And what I would say is that we're very fortunate that we have 51 kidney patients associations up and down the country, and they're all members of the National Kidney Federation. So one way of getting the right patients is contact your kidney patients association locally. If you don't know who they are or who to contact the National Kidney Federation. We need to make sure that the patients are representative. So for example, if the project is on dialysis, you need the dialysis patient to be the representative person. You don't need somebody who's had a transplant or has no experience of dialysis. And I'm particularly keen that representation means that we need to think about equality. And therefore, patients from BAME background and patients from lower socioeconomic class. That's very important. And sometimes we struggle to do that. But we also need to think about practical issues. So when we involve patients in projects, long-term projects, like the ones we've been talking about, we need to make sure that those patients are paid for their time and that any travel costs and so on are also met properly. So these need to be built in right at the beginning. And how do we make sure that patients have full access to the various meetings and so on? And one of the advantages of virtual meetings, that it'll be easier for some patients to participate in these sorts of projects now than perhaps in the past. In conclusion, I would really say that involve patients early, but patients must be valued and they must be supported.
Thank you, Kirit. So perhaps I can now ask Tracy, how can involvement be tailored to the availability of participating individuals? So how do we do that so that people are best able to participate given their availability? Thank you, Tracy.
I think I can best answer from how we went about setting up the patient group on for Assist CKD. We tried to have a group which was spread geographically across the UK, so it covered all of the or most of the renal units that we possibly could. We set out a group of 10 in the beginning. There were 6 mostly active members. We tried to involve patients that were from different backgrounds and with a different skill set. As Amjad said, he had a specific skill set in finance, and we had a GP that was also a dialysis patient. So we tried to cover all the bases with that, but we also tried to make sure that we not everybody needed to attend all the meetings. So some people worked with different work streams within the project. So everybody was able to answer questions by email. Some were able to attend meetings, some weren't. And we just tried to factor that all in so that everybody's viewpoint was well heard. So their skill set as a patient and behind the scenes, and the areas and the patients, which other patients they knew in their area, they also had their opinions covered. I think that was really important.
Thank you, Tracy. So it's about tailoring the response and the availability, and indeed the use of webinars may also enable that as well. I'd like to ask Amjad then, what's the most effective way or the most effective ways to involve people from a range of backgrounds?
Thank you, Martin. Sorry about that. I'm a little bit limited about what I can say regarding Assist CKD, but what I'd like to do is just talk to that point regarding the work that I've done for NHS Blood and Transplant and more recently with Kidney Care UK. Now, if I look at the way that we engage the communities around organ donation in Islam and looking at BAME engagement in general, then what's absolutely key is being able to demonstrate a respect and understanding of the cultural differences and the importance that those play in the decision-making process for those individuals. What I found absolutely key was people by people. Sharing my journey and lived experience as a patient has helped to build relationships with key stakeholder groups and enabled them and encouraged them to participate and come forward. And in terms of the other work, being clear about the ask, what's in it for your patient, your stakeholder. My approach has always been to be very clear using a simple one-page document, a balanced scorecard. And on that, you clearly state what your aims and objectives are, what the parameters are or the framework of the project or the piece of work that you're doing. And that ensures that people are able to contribute effectively. When they go off track, then you're able to bring them back on board. And what that does is it keeps the group focused. And I think the climate that we're living in, where inequality and disproportionality is at the forefront of everyone's mind, it's important that we're absolutely clear about what it is in terms of an outcome that we're hoping to achieve, so that particularly vulnerable groups don't feel like it's a tick box exercise.
Thank you, Amjad. That was very clear and very pragmatic. So I tripped up on the unmuting arrangement there. I apologize about that. Okay, so my next question now is for Andy. Andy, what's the benefit of involving more than one patient, or rather, how many patients should we involve? How do we decide about that?
I think Kirit and Amjad have actually covered quite a lot of these already. So I just, and including Tracy. So I'll briefly just go over a few. The last thing we want really is for a patient to feel as if they're tokenistic. So we do need to make sure there is more than one patient that is physically engaged in the program itself. Equally, diversity and culture of that group, then that is as much about age and ethnicity as it is about anything else. And clearly that then helps with the direction of the program and the representation of the program and how those links develop. There is this aspect in relation to being able to hold the program to account in relation to the more patients that you have, the more I suppose the breadth of the experience that you've got of patients there, which is then helping you to guide the program in particular ways, which is perhaps more generic than specific. In other words, it covers the patient group you want it to cover. We also have to consider, of course, that we're all very dodgy people in many ways, and the fact that we suffer from illnesses relatively quickly and quite shortly. So the more patients that you have, you can actually look after those individuals that aren't very well. You can perhaps work out some way in relation to keep them involved, but we have to be mindful that that is one of the aspects of engaging a patient. Equally, it can be a lonely place. So you have a load of people that are sat around a table, for example, at a meeting, who can talk to each other, who go away, and they network with each other. Whereas the patient will go, and where do they have nobody else to talk to. They just have clearly their peers that they can talk to when they go back to the unit if they're a representative, but they still have nowhere or nobody else to talk to. So the more groupings you have. Sonia mentioned earlier on about within the shared care program, we had it where on the learning days where the healthcare, the day was a co-produced day with everybody, but there was a time when the healthcare professionals had their time and us as patients had our time, and that was invaluable. So that's why you need a more reasonable amount of patients, a third to 50% at least.
Thank you, Andy. That's great. I'm just picking up a comment that's come in from Michael Rees, saying that more patients in a project can help to overcome the perceived power differences between researchers and the researched, particularly when the latter are in the minority group. So I think that's a very important observation, Michael. What I'd like to do then is ask Amjad to come back. No, actually, sorry, Kirit, can I put this one to you? What is the right balance then between healthcare professionals and patient partners on the group? How do you strike that balance? Thank you, Kirit.
I think the important principles here really, and the first principle for me is that the voice of the patient should be equal to that of the healthcare professionals on the project. And often that's not the case. And secondly, which again is difficult to achieve, is that patients should have a leadership role within the project. And because they bring expertise, there may be different expertise from the healthcare professionals. So they do bring strengths to the project. So their voice must be equal and they should have a leadership role. Those are important principles. How do we achieve that? Some people say, go for a 50-50 balance. So half the members of the project group are patients and the other half consists of healthcare professionals. If that works, that's fine. But it's not, there's no magic number. You need to ask the question as we go through the project, are we giving equal voice to the patients and have they got a leadership role? And we also have to accept we are patients. Our health changes regularly. And therefore, we have to be prepared that patients who are on long-term projects, that their health will suffer from time to time, and they may not be able to continue. So we do need a large pool of patients to be involved throughout the project.
Thank you, Kirit. Coming back to Andy then, what things should we consider when we're identifying potential patient roles? You're on mute there, Andy.
Okay, there we go. So we can talk quite a lot about this. In one way, it's a bit like if you're sort of having a job interview. So the patient and the clinician, if it's the clinician that's asking the researcher, need to have a clear understanding of what the patient or what's expected of the patient and what the actual program involves. And I think it's important to say from the very beginning that the patient themselves should not be seen as a free patient. They aren't just there because they're free. They are, I think the term is, their time is golden time, really. So it's really, really important. So it's about trying to make sure that they are happy when they're going to come in and join the program. Some of that is about not trying to oversell what the program is trying to deliver or what the patient engagement is going to be, and trying to get a good understanding from the patient in relation to how they understand what you were talking about in relation to the patient. Some of this engagement with motivational interviewing. Then there are some more basic questions about, so how will this affect their treatment? How will it impact on their family life? What skills in relation to what you've talked about do they think that they have to offer? What skills do they think that they don't necessarily have that they would like? What skills can you help them to do? And I will give a brief example of that shortly. And then it comes back to other areas which we've been talking about before, about where are the meetings? How often are they held? Are they online? Where did the agenda stuff come from? How do people understand when they're reading the agenda? And various aspects. Travel expenses, are they prepaid? Are they reclaimed? So that there's a whole raft of various things. And equally, I think it's important to try, where you've got a group of patients, to perhaps identify with the patient where there are other patients that are involved in the program itself. And it may well be that you are able to offer some coaching from that specific patients within that program, or there are other patients that you could do that. Clearly, one of the roles of CAPIN, if I can sell that a little bit, will be very much about trying to help to do that. So is there, will they be mentored by more experienced patients? So there's a raft of different things that you need to look at and you need to consider. And there is also this thing about, if the patient starts to feel uncomfortable or isn't quite sure that it's not what they thought it was, how can you help them? So what is your communication? How do you link with that specific patient? And will they be treated like a team member, I suppose, in many respects? The quick example I wanted was to a degree, it started with the first shared care program, the Closing the Gap, went on to the second one, where actually as a patient and a patient lead, I was involved in every training activity that the healthcare professionals were involved within that training. A lot of that was done by providers from the Health Foundation. They were both great fun, very enlightening, but it actually brought the team together, not the healthcare together with a patient coming in from the outside. So engaging, involving, and making the patient really feel that they are part of that engagement process.
Thank you, Andy. Amjad, from your experience, any other additional points when considering identifying patient roles?
Thank you, Martin. I've had the pleasure of working across a number of work streams looking at engagement, particularly from BAME communities. So if I can share a couple of examples, the key thing that I would say, which reinforces the point that Andy has made, is that it's vitally important to state at the outset what is the purpose and the role of the patient or the stakeholder that you're trying to engage. Is it that of advisor? Is it that of information source? Is it there as a critical friend? Because that setting that out at the outset will help define their role and the degree of influence that they have, and that will kind of dictate the way they engage and behave. For me, I think the biggest challenge for me at the moment, and I see this as a challenge and also as a great opportunity, that COVID-19 has highlighted so much around health inequality and disproportionality. And I think the webinar today, which is talking about patient involvement, I think this is now a critical time for all healthcare professionals to take this information away and recognize that we can't look at patients in silos, and we have to look at, particularly with BAME, multiple comorbidity issues that affect each other. And what is the best way I feel as a patient that I would want to be engaged is, rather than having everyone coming to me as an individual group, is for them to partner up and come to me as a wraparound that's telling me that if you've got this issue, then we can signpost you immediately to the other. And being able to share my lived experience that way will give me that degree of comfort and reassurance that you've genuinely got my interest at heart. Because otherwise, I think potentially we could lose a key stakeholder group in the whole process.
Thank you, Amjad. So in a sense, what you're saying is that enabling people to navigate through your experience is a real strength. Tracy, I would like to ask you then, everyone is different. How do we identify an individual's patient strengths and gain their confidence, help them build confidence to use those strengths that they have?
Sorry, that took me a while to press the unmute. Apologise. Technology, it just shows you we're all, as Andy just said, we're all getting much more used to technology, and COVID has brought that desperately rushing forward to everybody. So I think the main criteria really is, I mean, I know, say again, looking to my the groups that I've been working as a patient group member or leader on, and the project is really, I've really talked to people a lot in the beginning. We have separate patient group meetings. So we do try and encourage people's views, encourage their skills, encourage their opinions, and make them feel confident. And it really explains through the different work streams, you know, what would they like to be involved in, not just telling them what we want them to do. And in that, I think we can encourage different points of view and different voices, and encourage people's personal development, I hope, because I think that's what the process is, that even for myself and any of the others, the patients that are on this group, it's all part of our development. And I think the other thing is, the more involved you get with this kind of work, the more confident you get in being able to undertake those roles. So sharing that confidence, I think, is key.
Thank you, Tracy. So just to finish this section off, I just want to pass over to Andy and ask him if you would just tell us a bit more about helping patients gain the skills that they don't have, so that they can become more engaged and add value to the programme. Just a couple of lines on that, Andy, if you could do. Thank you.
Yeah, I mentioned before, and I think it's been a theme really across where we are at the moment. It is not easy to get patients to be involved, and there are some barriers that patients see in relation to being involved. There are patients that are enthusiastic about being involved, but how do they do that? And equally, for those of us that are experienced, and I'm not ashamed to say that for a lot of people I never knew before we started dealing with this, because again, we live in our bubble. So I would often meet 2 or 3 patients that I would know. They were always the same patients, and they are good to talk to, but you never get anybody really that's that can be a regular friend. So that's really why we came up with the idea of the Kidney Patient Involvement Network, that we would try and start with those that have some experience, to try and share those experiences. We're not trying to be a training provider, but we are trying to look at how we can provide these simple confidence, engagement, involvement practices that are there to try and help people to be engaged. And at the same time, create this mentoring coaching program where there are people on here who could mentor me on various aspects of what we're doing, but equally for those who want to be involved, where that experience could go across to other patients or carers that particularly want to be involved in specific service development, research, or quality improvement programs. So really that's why we started with CAPIN, and clearly some of that we are just touching on this issue at the moment in relation to patient involvement, and we're hoping really to try and help people like yourself and like Nick and the others that are listening in relation to trying to help them to get patients involved. We all want to have a meaningful role. We all want to make an impact rather than just sit there and be a token patient sat there. So, and that's really what CAPIN, as Kidney Care UK, as Kidney Research UK, and other providers are trying to do. But we are just trying to use a little bit of experiential learning through that. So.
Thank you, Andy. That's great. A very comprehensive answer. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to hand over to my co-chair, Claire, who's going to take us into the next session. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Martin. We're now going to look at the area of expectation management and whether or not what we expected is what we got. So the first two questions I'd like to touch on to start with myself. They are, did you know what you were letting yourself in for? And was it more or less what you expected? Having been a renal patient since childhood, things were very different back then. And we were encouraged to do as much and know as much as we could. So we were involved right from the go. So when I was asked if I would be interested in being involved in the transforming participation in chronic kidney disease, this seemed a great idea, especially since it was looking at PROMs and PREMs, that's patient-reported outcome measures and patient-reported experience measures. Well, as it happened, I was using them in my work. So I thought, great, no problem, we can do this. But it was so much more than just analysing data. First of all, we had to decide what PROMs we were going to use. So we worked together to look through them. Sorry, I ought to explain. I was on something called the measurement work stream, which was looking at finding a PROMs and a PREMs that we could use nationally to see and to put them out annually so that we could see whether or not things changed for patients. We could maybe identify what was happening in certain hospitals that weren't happening in other hospitals, so that we could mentor one hospital by another or things like that. It might be within departments, within different satellite units that things change. We just wanted to have a look. But first of all, we had to come up with these. So we looked through all the PROMs that there were for kidney patients, and we had to work out which one was best. So in the end, we found 2 or 3 which put together covered the majority. That was actually quite easy compared to the next step, which was coming up with a brand new patient-reported experience measure. Here was the nub of the problem. Initially, several of the professionals said, oh, it's okay, we'll do this and then we'll come back to you, the patients. Which of course the patients weren't too keen on. They said, no, it's about our experience. Let us come up with it and we'll tell you what we want on it. Neither of these were going to work. So we had eventually agreed to all sit down together. Everybody wrote down what they thought was wanted and then put together and see whether or not we could work out what the trends were. And these are still going strong today. Well, the PREMS certainly is because I'm involved in that, but it changes annually. We see we're still on a learning curve. But we compromised and we worked together, and decisions made together made it a lot easier. Right, I better hand on before getting into trouble for talking too much. Andy, pass over to you.
Right, I'm just going to start by a point I think Tracy made earlier on. If we look at patients as people and we look at what their background is as well as what their treatment is and what they're coming in for, and they aren't just kidney patients. So not only do we have patients that are confident or more or less confident in relation to what they are doing, we also have patients whose roles or their jobs actually are quite inventive in their self. So they have a considerable amount of experience in themselves. So when I first started, actually walking into a room with clinicians, whilst it was still daunting, it was something I was used to. That said, there are a lot of people they are not used to doing that. So and equally, when I first started as a patient representative, you sort of immediately start to find out where some of these holes are, and these were quality of life holes, and these are quite simple things like televisions, Wi-Fi, security, allowing people into a building. So And then when I went on to start on the shared care program, the first one, I had absolutely no idea what that involved. I felt confident enough to be doing it, and I felt confident enough to be able to tackle some of the aspects as they came along. But the program itself was helpful. But there was a lot to learn. And it's one of these things where you get very good at the end, but actually the program's finishing by the time you actually become impactful. The second one, which I did, which was the Share HD program, yeah, I knew exactly what was coming to a degree. You can never guarantee you know exactly what is coming. And I will say part of that is you know what is coming from the patients as a representative. It's a bit like being a union member, as well as from the healthcare side of it. So I'm fortunate that to start with, I was a little bit more confident than maybe some others are. But actually the second program, I knew what was coming.
Claire, you're on mute. Oh, you're fine.
Sorry, apologies, I pressed the wrong button. I'd like to now ask Nick's views on this subject, please.
Thanks. So this is just sort of, I guess, from the other side of the fence. So how do we, from a sort of the medical side, how do we sort of plan to manage expectations? And I think the first thing to say is we can always get better, and each time we do a project or a research study, each time we do something, we can learn and improve how we sort of get the patient involvement right. I think it's also a changing perception, really, and quite important to say that from a professional side, it's really valuable to hear that patient voice. So we do want to involve patients. So it shouldn't feel awkward. Sometimes that takes a little bit of time to build that relationship. If there's any of our Derby PPI group on this webinar tonight, just to say thank you and how much we do appreciate that input. And as sort of time goes on and your sort of patient group becomes more established, and as you've heard with comments from around the panel, confidence grows, skills sort of improve over time. I think that part of that skill set is knowing what's going to be involved with certain projects. So yes, there's the sort of the explaining and the being very clear. I think Amjad's sort of one pager at the start of a project is a great suggestion. But also by being involved in projects, you learn experientially what types of things might get asked and which you're comfortable with. And also from a healthcare professional point of view, always try and ask questions in a way that it's easy to say no, or actually that's too much, or the ask is too great.
Thanks, Nick. Now, Martin, could you briefly tell us what you think?
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, there's lots to say, but for me, you know, did I know what I was letting myself in for? No, I had no idea. I was very nervous. I thought if I organised a meeting with lots of patient partners, they would start to tell me what they thought, and I would get into serious trouble. And actually what happened was people started to talk about what mattered to them, and their stories were so powerful that really made the impact. So whenever we then took a patient partner with us to a meeting, the patient story was the thing that really turned the heads of the people who we needed to influence. And you know, they made such a huge difference. So over the years, I've been so persuaded that hearing it from the patient perspective is the way to start any piece of work, because that really is what makes it relevant. Thank you, Claire.
Sorry. Okay, thanks you for that, Martin. Now, going back to Kirit, could you answer the question, do you think that sudden familiarity with Zoom and everything will help patients to have meetings and get involved? Thank you, Kirit.
Yes, of course, Claire. I think we all know that Zoom has had a great impact across our society. We know that virtual social interactions amongst families and friends are now normal. We know that our consultations with GPs and with hospitals are by phone or by virtual video. We know that community events like religious services and so on are taking place through Zoom. So clearly there's a huge, I think, revolution in terms of the use of virtual ways, and this will continue for the foreseeable future. Now, I wanted to give you one example. There is a program called the Community Investment Scheme funded by NHSBT, and currently there are 25 projects led by PAME communities across the country, where people are doing amazing work in their own community, talking about the change in law on organ donation. And I'm pleased to say that a number of people who are participating in this webinar today, and I want to first thank them for what they're doing. Now, I was invited by one of these groups, the Vanik Council UK, to a webinar they organized. So this was a combination of religious aspects, entertainment, yoga, and health issues. It was only a few weeks ago, and I was quite apprehensive. And then we had 250 people on a Sunday afternoon taking part. I spoke about the change in law from a Jain perspective, because that's what their focus was. And they produced a YouTube video of this, so thousands of people have now heard it. And I bet none of those 250 people would have even dreamt of using Zoom 6 months ago. So this is really a revolution. I accept totally that whenever new things happen, there will be people who will be left behind. So we need to make sure that we don't challenge the inequality. So there's some people who will not have IT facilities and so on, and how we cater for them. But my view, Claire, is that let's embrace this revolution and Zoom whenever we can.
Thanks, Kirit. Yes, I think we wouldn't have managed to get as many meetings in for this if it hadn't been for Zoom. So I think we've learned from it. Okay, I'd like now to pass over back to Martin.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much for that really interesting session. So now I'm going to change our running order slightly. Della has been listening to what we've been talking about, and I'm going to ask Della if she would make some observations about what she's heard from her perspective, and then we'll go back to some of our questions after that. So Della, can I open the floor for you, please? Thank you. Della, you're on mute. There we go.
Sorry about that, Martin. I've been listening to all what's been said, and I'd probably sum up my reflection in 3 words: change, collaboration, and commitment. And I think now is really the time to change the narrative and the conversation with regards to patient involvement, and ensure that we have patients from all communities, but more importantly, that we have patients from the BEM community and also patients from lower social economic groups. They have powerful stories, they have powerful voices, and I think those stories and those voices can really bring about change. But I also think it's important that patients get involved in key decision makings, so that they're part of the decision making and that decisions are not just being made on their behalf. I think that's important. But the most important thing, I think also, that when you involve patients, it empowers them. It gives them that empowerment to be able to kind of voice their suggestions and what they feel is important. I think there's one in terms of collaboration and working with patients. It's important. And I think it just helps us build a better health service when you involve patients in terms of diversity. We then have more diversity within the workplace. And also, I also believe it builds better systems that will allow us to improve the quality of care. But I think more important as well, Martin, it will help us to remove a lot of those institutional barriers that actually create this health inequality. We saw the impact that had on the BAME community during COVID-19. And it's those things that I feel patient involvement can kind of break down some of those barriers. Again, I think that to have all of that in place, it will take commitment, not just from healthcare professionals, but all of us, you know, as a team. And I kind of feel that today can be that catalyst for more patients to kind of really get involved. But it will take that commitment, I feel, from all of us. 7 years ago, I came forward as a living kidney donor for my brother. To be honest, I don't know why I offered, because when we were growing up, my brother wasn't really that nice to me. I had to kind of do all his household chores as well as mine. But truthfully, actually, it was a no-brainer for me to come forward as a living donor for him. But sadly, I wasn't compatible and I couldn't continue the process. But I had two choices. I could have put that down to experience and move on, or I could use my experience to raise awareness of organ donation within the Black community. And I chose that. I just chose to use my experience to raise awareness of living donation within the Black community, because it wasn't something that people talked about. I would say 99% of the people who I spoke to that I was coming forward as a living donor didn't have a clue about what living donation was. So I set up Gift of Living Donation, and we work primarily within the Black community to raise awareness. I wrote a book about my experience called More Than a Match, and it really just talked about our journey, especially from a Black perspective. I was coming forward as a living donor. We also held the very first event last year, and we brought together across the UK all the Black living donors within the UK. So that was the first event, and that was great. It was great just seeing Black living donors share their experience in terms of what their experience was, you know, for them. But if I'm going to end, for me, it's like, we don't want to repeat, and we don't want to see the health crisis and the health inequalities affected by BAME communities during the recent pandemic. And if we do say that Black lives matter, then we have to focus on a lot of the solutions and not the problems. We know what the problems are. We don't want the solutions just to be, I think, just gestures whereby, okay, let's promote BAME people into higher positions, or really commissioning another report on racism within the professions. But it will take, for me, I think, a real reconstruction of the whole healthcare system. But we can't do that unless patients get involved. So I think that's key. There's change is going to happen. It has to have patient involvement. And I would say, be the change that you want to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Della. That was very powerful. Thank you very much indeed. And the point that you make is well taken, that if we wanted to have a more equal healthcare system, it really does involve working collaboratively with patient partners. Thank you very much for that. So the next question I want to explore is around peer support, because peer support really is a means of trying to help people to work in this sort of way. And perhaps I can put the question to Andy. What did you think about peer support? Could it have been better within the program that you worked in?
Well, the answer for that was quite simply is yes. But did we have peer support? Yes, we did. And I think, again, it comes down to how much involvement you have at the very beginning about how you set up a peer support program. It cannot just be two people talking to each other. So there needs to be some meaningfulness behind it. And also, Kirit mentioned at the beginning about sometimes patients. When I first did the shared care program, I was a dialysis patient. When it came to do the second one, I was a transplanted patient. So, but that does not mean to say I forgot all about HD, but it just means I'm not current in that specific process. So therefore, what we did within the 19 hospitals is we had 19 patients, or more than 19 patients if we could have done, which were an inclusive group of patients. And we started by having these group sessions together at various times throughout the program. That then morphed itself into having online groups that we were doing the mentoring through the online groups. And it didn't take very long before actually the group itself was mentoring itself online on WhatsApp. And indeed that continues still to this day, and the program's been finished some 18 months or so. So, and again, within CAPIN, that's one of the priorities that we have, is about how do we produce a simple mentoring program which isn't onerous, because we can't afford to be onerous, we can't take lots of people's time, and how can we do that in an effective way. So it is important, it does need some thought, and it can't just be something that you slam together, because you can do as much damage through peer support as you can good.
So we need important mechanisms to make that work well, but it can work very effectively. Thank you, Andy. So the next question goes to Nick. Nick, here's a really challenging question for you. Is it possible to redesign kidney care in conjunction with kidney patients? Is it possible to do so? Tell us the answer.
Yes, it is. That's an easy one, Martin. I guess that's why we're all here, because that's what we believe in. So it's an easy question to answer like that, but as we all know, it's far more challenging to do it in real life. I do think that some of the learning that we've got from the Health Foundation funded projects that you and Sonia have brought together in the report together really bring some different aspects of how to do that, and some quite different approaches of how to do that together. And I think it would be really nice if we can consolidate that learning and keep working on the most important messages and refining them, including in forums like this, to sort of really distill that out. I think the other area is that we can learn from maybe is how the patient voice is really embedded into the research world now, and quality improvement sits in that sort of grey area between delivery of healthcare and research at the other side. But really there's some good examples now of how patient groups and how patients really sort of take roles throughout the design, the development, the oversight and the leadership of research, that all of those messages apply to the structure and the working of quality improvement as well. So yes, I think the answer is yes. And as we go forward and acknowledge that and work on this, I think it'll be something we hopefully will see more and more of.
So it's a journey and we're on it. Thank you very much, Nick. There's a long way for us to go, but absolutely essential. So I've got a really key question now I'd like to share with Amjid, and that is, how do you build and maintain trust?
Thank you, Martin. This is absolutely key. And as I mentioned earlier, we live in unprecedented and uncertain times. There are lots of concerns for all patients of all communities. And as Della has beautifully articulated, if we're talking about real change and sustainable change, then it requires real commitment. One of the things that I've learned in the various pieces of work that I've been involved in is that we have to look at patient engagement as the beginning of a commitment to pursuing a more comprehensive engagement. We have to think about building it on mutual trust, mutual respect and mutual responsibility. I think it's about helping to empower, to build that sustainability. For me personally, you've got to be able to feel the change. One of the things that I can share with you, that when I spoke to this group and came on board, I was a patient for 23.5 years on dialysis. I never spoke to another patient in all that time. I didn't join a kidney patient association. I didn't reach out to any of the charities. Now being involved, I now know how much support is out there, how much is available. And I think it's really important that everyone, healthcare professionals, support agencies, look at the way that they communicate, how they engage, and how they build that trust and confidence with all communities, not just BAME, but all communities. And that for me is what I've taken away in the more recent weeks from having this conversation.
Thank you very much, Hamwood, for your comprehensive answer. Kirit, can I just ask you to highlight perhaps how the NKF helps with that?
Yes, I think there have been a couple of questions, Martin, about KPAs, and I want to pick those up because, as I said, we've got 51 kidney patients associations up and down the country. They are run by volunteers like me and others, and some are doing very well and very active and so on, while others are struggling. So one of our roles as the National Federation of KPAs is to offer them support and advice. And it's not an easy task because sometimes you'll have half a dozen people on a kidney patients association working over many years, struggling to find new members and to move forward and so on. So what we've done recently, just last few months, is that we have appointed within the NKF an NKF KPA liaison person. So his name is Mark Davis, and many of you will know about him, that his job is to support kidney patients. So there were a couple of questions about KPAs which are struggling, and we are here to help you. And in fact, as I said, as president of the NKF, which I took over fairly recently, we are now examining a strategy for the NKF moving forward, particularly in light of COVID. And one of the things we're looking at is how can we support the KPAs better so that they can be empowered to engage with the wide range of work which they need to do at this critical time.
Thank you, Kirit. That's great. So our last pre-prepared question, if you like, I want to give to Andy, and that is, what structures should we have to enable longer-term support for patient partners? Thank you, Andy. Andy, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm certainly not aware, or I wasn't aware of that many people that actually, when a patient had gained all that experience that they'd got through the program, that they were then just suddenly released, and that experience was in some way lost. And clearly, there are some patients that once they've done elements of it, that's it. They're quite happy to go on to things that are better. But one of the things that we were looking at really is, so how can we capture that experience and how can we look after it? So one of those was with the Kidney Patient Involvement Network. I know I keep bringing that up, but clearly I would. And I think once the relationships have been built and people know and they've learned from each other, then there is this aspect about trying to use patients on other aspects. Now, whether the second program they go on, they are more, they have somebody with them, so they are teaching them. So it's a bit like a handover, I suppose, in many respects. So that's the only way that I know of really doing it. Clearly, I think people have their contact lists, but once patients have gone within a reasonable amount of time, their interest is lost.
Right, thank you, Andy. That's great. So we're now going to move into a discussion session and pick up some of those questions that you presented to us. Claire, is that working for you, or shall I start with the first one before you come in? So I can see a question here, which I'll start, and then you can take one. I like this question from Martin Cunningham. Is it always possible to lump all kidney patients together into a single pot? Is it not true that the cause of kidney failure can throw up specific issues? What I'm interested here is the individuality of the patient experience. So perhaps I can ask Tracy if she would like to have a go at that question, if she would like to. Is that all right?
That's fine, no problem, Martin. I think it's there's two things I'd really say. Firstly, clearly no patient is the same as another patient. And I think the adage of no decision about me without me is very, very true. And I think as we are evolving as a society and as patients are getting more involved, my 87-year-old mother-in-law was recently poorly and agreed to some additional chemotherapy. And when we said, why did you do that? She said, well, he's a doctor, you can't argue with him. And I think that kind of attitude is changing, and we are all happier, or more, we more feel able and confident to actually question doctors about things. And one thing in the renal service, which I think my daughters have found very helpful, is specialist nurses, because sometimes they're a little bit more approachable. They seem to know, with no disrespect to you, Martin or Nick, they seem to know almost as much as the doctors about patients and procedures and treatments and outcomes. And I think that's very important. And they also, I think the other thing is to really change or think about the way, whether you're a GP or a doctor in secondary care, the way you go about your appointment. Instead of just sitting down, looking at your computer, looking at blood results or whatever, look at the patient, ask them how they are, ask them what's bothering them that day. So trying to sort up a dialogue and really understand the patients and what their individual needs are, as opposed to treating everybody the same. Sometimes they might just say some little odd snippet to you about how they're feeling, and you realize that means something completely different. And just a small tweak in their treatment, or the way you speak to them, or their drug regime, or any other points, can make a massive difference to that patient, and they can go away a lot happier.
Thank you, Tracy. Claire, you take the next one.
I was going to say, I've got a question here from David Coyle for Andy. Patient role profiles can help clarify expectations, burdens of work, and provides legitimacy to patient role. It can also be a baseline for assessing patient involvement, quality, and impact. And he's interested in your views. Well, our views, but if you'd answer it, please. Thank you. You're muted, Andy.
Yeah, I know David quite well. And actually, I need to thank David, because he was one of the co-founders of Capin. So, and one of the things that we were finding was, particularly when I started with Martin on the shared care program, was it's okay sort of trying to explain what it is to be a patient lead, but actually, what does that mean? What does that physically mean? And the amount of time that I spent on things like the internet, because I had nobody else to talk to, really, about what sorts of things should we have. I knew in my head from my work what types of things I needed. And some of those were what we talked about earlier on, about just making sure that patients have guidelines in relation to what their expectation is, because if they're not actually meeting what you want them to do, then they're not in the right place at that particular time. So we had patient champions, for example. So where are any patient champion guidelines? There aren't any. So I had to write those. And where are specific, well, there's a variety of different guidelines which are helpful for people to look at. We're currently having things like working groups, patient advisory groups. So what are the boundaries, and how do people know what you mean when you say those words? So again, that's what Capin is trying to do, is bring those examples and put them into one place. So it stops that hour and hour of looking, trying to find something, where you can actually pick something, adapt it to your circumstance, and then use it. So you cannot underestimate the amount of time that takes to physically do that.
Thank you, Andy. I now have a question for Della and Amjid. How can we make things so that they are clear and transparent, so that people from other than the white population will trust what is written? Amjid.
Okay, if I may use the example of the work that I've done on behalf of NHS Blood and Transplant in terms of securing an updated religious or edict from an Islamic perspective. One of the key things that I found, why did I wait so long for an organ off the organ donor register? And from a Muslim perspective, it was really down to the fact that most members of the Muslim community don't understand the Islamic position from a faith perspective. And what we couldn't do was to go out and assume that everybody knows everything about the faith and everyone understands the jurisprudence behind the decisions of a scholar. So what we did very early on was build a stakeholder base of our community engaged stakeholders, and that included scholars, imams, clinicians, community organizations, patients, individual influencers, and sought the insight that we needed to kind of understand where the pinch points were, where the blockages were, and develop an updated edict that addressed all of those concerns. So I think in terms of building that trust and confidence, you've got to be able to first listen, truly understand, reaffirm the position that you've taken with your stakeholder base, and then develop the solution or the product or the package that you're putting forward back in a manner that shows transparency. One other thing I'd like to say, and I don't think it's kind of covered, just if I don't get the opportunity, is that we put a lot of emphasis on the need for patients to come forward. One of the key signpost areas for that is in primary and secondary care. And I think the question we should be asking ourselves here as well is how can we better support our GPs and secondary care for the clinicians in understanding how to broach the subject with their patients in order to come forward to be part of a program around inequality improvement, because that's where I missed the opportunity in the time that I was a patient. Nobody ever asked me, Amjid, would you like to contribute your ideas or your feelings or your thoughts about how you feel you've been treated as a patient? It's only now that I'm involved in the process that I can see that the door is already open and has been open for years. And I think we just need to do more to support everybody in the process, not just one stakeholder group.
Thank you, Amjad. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to come to this sort of wrap up because of time. Although we've got many more questions, we'll try to send them to you in terms of answers later on. But there's a question for Sonia, and that is, how do we differentiate between volunteer and paid roles? Sonia, can you perhaps try and take that if possible?
Sorry. I'm very dark. Sorry, I've come off video. I wasn't normally on video for most of this. So we can differentiate between paid and unpaid, but it's very much about what is said at the beginning when you're setting up a program. I mean, clearly, when you're setting up a program at the start, you need to consider what you're doing with involvement of patients and ensure that you've built that into the model, the financial model for your program, and not ignored it. That's the first clear thing. So right at the very beginning, you need to think about how many, where, what, where, how. Patients need to be involved in the same way as you would with clinicians, with nurses, with any other element, and build it into your model. And then make sure that that is also, the expectations are set with patients so that people understand what those roles and that funding actually is going forward. But I think that's a Jennifer question that's been raised. So Jennifer, perhaps we can pick up offline and talk you through more options for how you can do that.
Thank you, Sonia. So I'm going to move to our summary slide now. I realise that there's still questions we've not answered, but there's the sands of time are flowing past. So can I come to the summary slide? So essentially, we've had a really energetic conversation. We've heard the answers to key questions, and we've had a conversation with a wonderful panel, and that's been really important this afternoon. The points that we thought were key that we should pick up on, and we've put these in the slide set that we've shared with you and also in that report. I'm just going to go through those. In terms of patient partnership in these kind of projects, make sure that you involve more than one patient representative. That's absolutely key. And that you involve patients early, as we heard, during the concept stage, and so that they can influence the design of the project. It's really key that you describe the patient role clearly so that people know what is involved and what they're expected to be doing. It's essential that we're genuinely representative of people from a range of backgrounds so that we can hear the different perspectives of service users and how that should influence the development of the service. It's really important that we have review mechanisms so people can hear how they're getting on and can get the support they need in order to develop their potential going forward, enabling you to match involvement to motivation, understanding people's particular skills that they bring. Be clear about expenses and remuneration and make sure that's clear up front and that it's not difficult for people to get access to the expenses that they need it's important it's not bureaucratic. Consider the accessibility of meetings, and indeed Zoom, etc., has made a big difference to that, so that really we can work with much larger groups of individuals, but we still need to be conscious of the barriers around accessibility. Not everyone's got access to the IT that we are using today, for example. Develop peer support and mechanisms to support people so that they can gain in their confidence, and foster co-production more broadly. In other words, working together to develop the goals that we're aiming for. And then, of course, it's important to consider the longer-term patient role as well. The patients that we've got here, the patient partners we have here, have built experience over many years, and they are an enormous asset to us working together, trying to develop the service. And that didn't come overnight. That requires long-term support. So now I'd like to turn to our final slide, if that's all right. And that's the slide really which gives you highlights many of the partners involved in this work. And these are resources for you to look at and to think about, and groups for you to link with, as well as dates for your diary. And it's for me at this point to thank all of our participants, to thank KQIP for supporting this, the Health Foundation for funding the report that we wrote, our patient partners for joining us in this panel and really energetically and really sort of clearly telling us what matters in this work and enabling us to take it further forward together. I really subscribe to what Della said there, that without genuinely involving patient partners going forward, we won't be able to make our healthcare service more equal and more accessible, and everyone believes this very strongly. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our delegates for participating. I'm sorry we've not answered all the questions, but we will look at them and send them out to you in terms of answers. We'll share materials with you. There is a post-webinar questionnaire for you to complete, and we'll come back to you soon with the answers. So to everyone, Amjit and Kirit and Della and Claire and Tracy and Sonia and Nick, and also behind the scenes, Ranjit and Catherine, who've been working on this. Thank you for your hard work and for your engagement. And to all our delegates, have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.